Now I'm very pleased to ask Heather Fletcher to be our next speaker. Heather was born and brought up in Salford, is the daughter of an Irish father and a Mancunian mother. She attended Manchester High School for Girls and studied law at Birmingham University. She qualified as a solicitor and practiced for 10 years as a family and divorce law specialist. Thereafter, she worked as a law cost draftsman and ran her own law costing business for 15 years. In 2016, she left the legal profession for local politics when she was elected as a Labour councillor for Swinton on Salford City Council. She finds this very fulfilling and interesting. Heather was the company secretary of our Muslim Jewish Forum since its inception for 9 years and has now been the Jewish co-chair for almost 6 years. As well as interfaith work, her hobbies include public speaking, photography, doing oil painting by numbers, going to the cinema, and above all, sightseeing holidays with friends. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, June. Yeah, I thought what you said sounded familiar. Anyway, without any further ado, I'll talk about my side, which is actually Jewish immigrants to the UK. Now, Jewish people have been living in this country as far back as 1066, when William the Conqueror invited a group of French Jews to come over with their commercial skills. In the Middle Ages, lending money with interest was considered a sin by Christians. So the monarchs found it useful that Jewish people were allowed to engage in this practice. There were some very famous medieval Jews, such as Aaron of Lincoln, and he helped to finance Lincoln Cathedral. However, by the mid-12th century, things turned sour, and there were the blood libels, in which Jews were falsely accused of murdering 2 young boys, namely William of Norwich and Hugh of Lincoln. Subsequently, there were Jewish massacres in both York and Bury St Edmunds. All this culminated in Jews being expelled from this country in 1290. Jewish people were readmitted just over 350 years later by Oliver Cromwell. Although there were notable Jews here in the 18th century, such as the prize fighter Daniel Mendoza, I now wish to turn to the mid-19th century, when there was far more significant Jewish emigration to these shores. In 1855, David Solomons became the first Jewish Lord Mayor of London. And in the 1870s, Benjamin Disraeli became the first Jewish-born Prime Minister. At this time, many Jews grew up as Christians to fit in. Disraeli, as you may know, was baptized a Christian, but he was always very open about his Jewish heritage. And this led him to receive abuse and snide comments in the House of Commons. On one occasion, after he received a snide comment, he answered back, "When the ancestors of the right honourable gentleman were brutal savages in an unknown island, my ancestors were priests in the Temple of Solomon." The main influx of Jews to the UK was in the 1880s, following the pogroms in Russia and Poland, which caused them to flee their homes. The early Jewish immigrants tended to be Sephardic, that's Jews of Spanish and Portuguese origin. But the Jewish immigrants of the 1860s onwards were Ashkenazi Jews who were of Eastern European origin. It's very important to note that they were not made to feel welcome when they arrived in this country. There were signs over houses which were for rent, saying quite starkly, "No dogs, no Irish, and no Jews." And that lasted up until the 20th century. By the 1890s, there were 46,000 Jews in the UK. Here in Manchester, thousands of Jews made the city their home as early as the 1860s. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and dreams of a brighter future. Most settled in the deprived Red Bank area, where families of 10 or more crammed into tiny houses. The community leaders provided work for them and formed the Manchester Board of Guardians, which is now known as the Jewish Social Services. And this ensured the immigrants were able to have basic necessities and receive loans to help them set up businesses and to look after their welfare generally. Jews in Manchester from the 1880s set up many synagogues. They also set up their own Jewish schools, cultural bodies, and even a Jewish hospital. The reason for this was, once again, they were not made to feel welcome by the indigenous population. So that meant they had no option whatsoever other than to set up their own institutions. At Derby Street, the Jews' school, they were told to anglicise their names and customs so they would feel more accepted. They also started up youth movements like the Jewish Lads Brigade to emulate the British Scouts, which they hoped would make them become more accepted by the wider community. One of the early Jewish immigrants to Manchester was a man called Jacob Lipstein, or Lipsteinash. He was from a place called Vilkaviškis in Lithuania. He was also my great-great-grandfather, and he settled in Manchester in 1868. When he arrived, he spoke no English and was illiterate. He resided with his wife and 10 children in a Red Bank slum. However, he forged a good life for himself and family and eventually owned a slipper factory. He was charitable and learned and lived until he was 100 years old. He was an inspiration. His descendants are scattered all over the globe, and they include many lawyers, artists, and at least one local politician. Also in Manchester at this time, there were groups of Jewish intelligentsia who shaped new expressions of Judaism, including the Reform movement, and they created tools for activism which made the Jewish community strong advocates of both British socialism and trade unionism. Now we go to the 20th century. By 1919, there were 250,000 Jews in this country. Actually, it's pretty much the same today. However, Britain did not, and this is important to note, again, Britain did not open its arms unreservedly to Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazi regime. However, they did agree to accept 40,000 Jews from Germany and Austria, and a further 10,000 children who came here on the Kindertransport. Again, it should be noted it was often the British upper classes who were the most anti-Semitic. This was known as aristocratic resentment. And I wish to turn to a really important event which happened in the 20th century, and that was called the Battle of Cable Street, who I'm sure many of you have heard of this on the call. This occurred in 1936 in the East End of London. The British Union of Fascists, led by Oswald Mosley, organised a march through the heart of the East End, which at that time was very densely populated with Jewish people. This march was clearly motivated by anti-Semitism. 3,000 fascists went on this march, but thankfully they were outnumbered by 20,000 anti-fascists. These obviously included the Jewish people, but they were supported by Irish dockers. I'm glad to see the other part of my ancestry, the Irish people supporting the Jewish people there, and socialists and communists. Also in the 1930s, the famous playwright, the late Jack Rosenthal, recalls his father coming home in the 1930s with a black eye after he heckled Oswald Mosley, the fascist, at a rally at the Free Trade Hall. Jack also remembers dodging flying bricks whilst a schoolboy walking to the Derby Street Jews School in Cheetham, also sometime in the 1930s. As you can see from my short speech, Jewish immigrants from the 1860s to the 1930s, which was the main part of the Jewish immigration to this country, they faced hostility, they faced anti-Semitism, and they were generally not welcomed in this new country. Of course, Muslim people, Asian people, Black people subsequently encountered this same experience later in the 20th century. I believe it was the Jewish strength of character and determination to succeed which saw them through, like my great-great-grandfather. I will conclude with a paragraph from a poem called They Came from the Haim. The Haim is basically a generic term for where a lot of the Jews came in the middle of the 19th century, which was Eastern Europe. So this is just one paragraph from that poem. They came from the Haim. Hopes were dashed with fears. To eke out a living with laughter and tears. And a new kind of name. To live a new life. They came from the Haim. Thank you.